Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're logging on in the world, and welcome to the Business and Places Day of Energy Security and Green Infrastructure Week, sponsored by 2 Blues Solar. Our first keynote session today is dealing with what I think is a very topical issue of EV charging and what we need to do to get it right for everybody. With electric vehicles becoming an ever more common sight on the nation's roads, the question of how to achieve the right EV charging in the right places and also ensure that it's equitable and affordable are all key questions that need to be addressed if we're to grow the numbers of EV users and also to help achieve net zero targets. In this session, we've got 3 expert speakers who are going to be addressing some of those crucial questions. We've got Colin Herron from the Faraday Institution North East office, and the North East Battery Alliance at Newcastle University. We've got Juliet Flamank from the Green Finance Institute, and we've also got Councillor Mete Coban, MBE from Hackney Council. If there are any questions that people have got during the course of this discussion, please post them in the chat and we'll do our level best to get to them during the course of the conversation. Anyway, our first speaker is Professor Colin Herron of the Faraday Institution North East office and the North East Battery Alliance School of Engineering at Newcastle University. He's going to look at just what is, or what might be, the appropriate and viable UK charging infrastructure for the expected number of registrations in a city or region at a particular point in time, and whether we really have a handle on what that actually is. Colin, the floor's yours.
Thank you. I'm just sharing the presentation. There we are. That should be up and ready. Good morning, all. As you said, my name's Colin Herron. I'm from Newcastle University, and I've been investigating the rollout of EV infrastructure since 2009. One of the things I want to go through is the challenge of how to do this in a more modelling or mathematical logic. The first thing I've put up here is looking at the performance of infrastructure, which is split, as we know, between fast charging, which is AC, and high power charging, excuse me, which is DC. The UK government have set requirements for availability, and use normally gets referred to as utilisation. One of the things that I want to highlight, which is, I believe, ignored by government and other bodies, is what is called the limiting or controlling factors. I know it looks a lot on here, but we have to decide the difference between the number of chargers required and the power required, which are not separate. There is a lot of factors which apply to electric vehicles which do not apply to internal combustion engines, because basically it's a linear fuel delivery into a petrol tank, but all these factors come into play when we're looking at charging a car. And battery car technology changes all of the time, and as that technology changes, it affects all those boxes which I've shown, and the one which I believe is completely ignored is what is known as the behaviours. What will people actually do with these vehicles and the charging? The UK has produced a strategy, and it is often quoted that we require 300,000 chargers. What I've done in here is I've taken a part of the UK strategy and I've underlined those items which I think are worth noting, especially when it says estimate, uncertain, uncertainty, assuming, and it then says around 300,000. But it also says it could be 700,000. And it also decides that a public charge point is a single entity, whether it's a 7 kilowatt or a 350 kilowatt. So this is obviously a problem. And then when you look at what the authors have written, you will see that this is an economic model for the UK, of which there is no spatial component, no planning foresight, and it's based on current and widely used charge point technologies. And all estimates have been provided at a national level, which means, in effect, that I know we've got a person on from Hackney. Hackney is considered the same as Keswick in the Lake District. There's no differentiation. So when you look at this spread of 300,000 to 700,000, not defined by type, and look at the caveats, it does suggest that the strategy is at least not reliable. And we also have a situation where we have some 350 councils, combined authorities, all got their own strategy, and we've also got the private sector installing what they believe is required for their business needs. So how should we address this? We need to be a bit more scientific on this, and we need to look at geospatial modelling of the entire country, of where these vehicles are likely to go on a timeline. By now, by in 5, in 10 and 15 years, where the second-hand vehicles will go. So that model there was when I used to do some work with Jacobs, and that was an area just looking at some features. The next question is, how often do people charge? People always talk about 6 o'clock charging. We know that's not true. Where do people charge? The options are changing all of the time. When do people charge? What is the charging window in the day? What is the supply of these vehicles like? What is the limiting factor? It's not the number of charge points, it's cost and availability. We're starting to get this data, but it is being excluded from strategy. So where do I believe we are? We only know what infrastructure we have in the UK when ZapMap gets told. None of us know what is actually going in the ground today or in the future. We actually don't know how many should go in by type, where or when. We certainly don't know how people will use them, as they've never used it before, and we need to guess what 35 million people will do. The current measures of success used, i.e. charges per 100,000 population, are actually quite meaningless. So I believe we're in a very difficult position to hit the targets for 2030 and 2035. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin, for that. I think we'll certainly return to some of those uncertainties and unknowns and known unknowns and unknown unknowns during the course of the conversation. But thanks for the moment for that introduction. Our next speaker is Juliet Flamank, and she's the Charging Infrastructure Lead at the Green Finance Institute. She's going to examine how we facilitate the flow of finance required to fund the appropriate and necessary charging infrastructure that we need for a just transition. And she's also going to look at some of the barriers to investment, as well as the models and products that could help overcome those barriers, and hopefully what the sector could look like in 10 years' time. Juliet, over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Andy. I've got some slides to share as well, but perhaps just a little bit of background on the Green Finance Institute for those who do not know. So we were set up in 2019 as a direct response to a key policy recommendation that was made in the first Green Finance strategy. And essentially, we sit between the public and the private sector. And we convene and lead coalitions of global experts working on identifying and then unlocking the barriers to investments in green solutions. So trying to work to create the right environment for investment to flow, at pace and scale by designing new financial products, data and knowledge sharing tools. So if I take us on, so through several reports and documents at the organisation, we have mapped out kind of the charging infrastructure landscape to understand the size of the opportunity and the barriers that exist. I think Colin's touched already on the importance of getting the right chargers in the right space to ensure that we have this appropriate and viable network. And an important mind shift change really has to take place for that to be delivered. I mean, the first one, again, picking up on Colin's point, a move away from thinking about absolute numbers of charge points to instead thinking about, what's the optimal solution for delivering the power demand that is required. And then, as well as a shift to building ahead of demand in areas where EV transition still needs to take place. And obviously, all of this requires, a flow of finance to actually fund this network. And although the sector, has seen some large capital injections over the last couple of years, we really do need to encourage this further. And from the GFI's perspective, there are some, really key finance enabling factors to consider. I mean, to pick up again on one that Colin mentioned, geospatial modeling. And I cannot emphasize enough the importance of data in financial decisions. So, I mean, this lack of data is consistently highlighted to us as probably, the key barrier for investment in this space. So we need to see increased availability of both historic and predictive data, especially utilization data, as this is what obviously drives revenue and is therefore, an important KPI for investment decisions and calculating payback periods for investment decisions. There are some fantastic organizations, already working on data availability, including ZapMap, who we worked with in the summer to release some current utilization data. Also, something to flag, you've got the incoming government regulations, which will mandate open data, but these don't come until next year. And at GFI and actually in that paper with ZapMap in the summer, we have encouraged data sharing to start happening before then, because it's only with that increased availability that we will actually get the flow of finance that we need. Obviously, there is data, beyond utilization data. I think Colin's touched on some super interesting points there as well. Um, and this data, this might be data on how to on driver behavior, which therefore might influence how they would utilize charge points. Now, from the finance perspective, why that's important is it can help infrastructure owners identify levers that they can pull, and to drive up the utilization of their network and therefore optimize the existing network that they have before building additional charge points. On the screen, there are some examples of kind of other reports and informative guidebooks that we've released. The idea is that, these are educational resources for new investors, lenders, installers, and policymakers, because, and again, that's quite a big barrier that we see in this space, actually understanding the underlying technology, key terminologies. So that's what we've been trying to do with some of the data sharing tools. Obviously, in addition to finance enabling products, we've also been working on, how new partnership models and blended finance applications and the development of innovative de-risking financial products, how can these actually harness the required private sector investment, to deliver a just transition? Because, when we think about what is the sector going to look like in 5-10 years time, from the finance perspective, the big one for us, the big difference is that we will shift to a predominantly privately funded network. So how do we make sure we get that finance in? And why do we actually need innovative de-risking financing products? Well, traditional financing structures are currently not delivering this appropriate network at the pace and scale required. Installations tend to follow commercial returns. So this is areas where the infrastructure owners have identified higher EV density, larger cities, they'll get higher utilization sooner. This means that there are gaps in infrastructure in areas such as rural areas, seasonal areas, and lower income areas, as installers are concerned that there won't be the necessary utilization in the short term to pay back the installation costs. However, without visible charging infrastructure, drivers in these areas will not feel confident to transition to an EV, thus creating this chicken and egg problem. So just finally, that's why at GFI we've been designing a product called utilization linked financing, which can be for charge point operators, local authorities, small businesses, corporates, whoever's incurring the cost of installing the infrastructure. And the repayments of the cost of the installation will only commence, once charge points are revenue generating, and then would be tied to utilization going forward. creating a flexible repayment plan in the hope that this will encourage installations ahead of demand to encourage those drivers to transition. This product could also work very well with public capital, providing a guarantee, and is therefore an example of how blended finance mechanisms can really help harness the required private sector investment to deliver a just transition. This is obviously just one example, something that we at GFI are working at. I think there are lots of other great organisations, thinking on how can we de-risk investment, but this is one for us. And we've actually launched a pilot of this type of financing this summer, and hope to be able to share more of the lessons learned next year. But for now, I'll pass back to Andy and look forward to answering obviously any questions that might come up on this.
Thanks very much, Julia. It's good to hear what kind of packages and initiatives are available, and I think we'll certainly dwell on that a little bit when we come to the Q&A, because I know that the Green Finance Institute have recently announced various initiatives, including its local climate bonds toolkit, which I'm probably going to ask you about when we get to the Q&A. But for now, thanks for that introduction. Our next speaker is Councillor Mete Coban, MBE, who's the Cabinet Member for Climate Change, Environment and Transport at Hackney Borough Council. They have taken, I would say, a bit of a leadership role in this area around EV charging, and Mete is going to talk about that work, where they basically provided and operate charging point rollout of over 2,500 fast and slow chargers across the borough. And I'm very interested to hear what Mete's got to say. So Mete, over to you.
Yeah, morning everyone. Apologies in advance for my voice. Still recovering from a winter cold, so trying to get grips with that. Firstly, a pleasure to be here and to talk to you a bit about Hackney's plans and how we're trying to rapidly electrify or roll out electric vehicle charging points across the borough. I think it's really important to say that as a borough, it stems from our journey in terms of how serious we take tackling climate change. More than 70% of residents in Hackney don't own a car, so the majority of residents in Hackney either walk, cycle, or take public transport. In fact, actually 10 of London's 25 busiest bus routes in London are in Hackney. We've got an extensive overground network, and we've got great alternative methods of transport like dockless bikes, car club bays, etc. So whilst it is our ambition to still shift away from the motor vehicle in the borough and to try to create a more equitable space for road users, we are obviously keen to make sure that we're able to support residents in their transition to greener vehicles, and that's something that in my role since being in cabinet for over 3 years now, I know that lots of residents who are interested in buying electric vehicles are obviously concerned about the infrastructure around the charging, and that's a big deterrent and barrier for them to sort of purchase a vehicle in the first place. So previously, we had about 350 electric vehicle chargers across the borough. That includes lamp columns, a couple of fast chargers across the borough, and that's nowhere near enough to sort of the levels that we need to be able to one, sort of help reach our net zero ambitions of reaching net zero by 2030, but also equally, we're not going to be able to, if you're a resident, you're not going to sort of buy an electric vehicle and then sort of park your car like 6-7 streets away. So what we've done is, and I think worked very well, and it's a great model for other boroughs to follow, is rather than going out to secure through tendering to secure a supplier for a couple of hundred EV charging points, we went out to secure a supplier for 3,000 electric vehicle charging points, which is a mixture of the rapid and slow chargers, as you mentioned, Andy, and that's to deliver that by 2030. So that's 2,500 by 2026, and we've just announced our partnership earlier this year with Zest, who's going to be working with Hackney to be able to deliver that across the borough. What's really powerful about our plan in Hackney is that everything is being branded under Hackney Light and Power. It's the council's energy services company. and Hackney Light and Power, it's almost like providing consistency to the sort of consumer, in the sense that you're not ending up having to work with lots of different brands or download lots of different apps. But there's also some equitable sort of offer that we have for residents in terms of providing a discount for them for charging as well, and working through the technology on how we can make sure that happens. And then that is all wrapped around sort of the infrastructure around the parking, so making sure that we've got EV dedicated parking bays across the borough. And we're going through a whole engagement plan at the moment with residents to identify where we need to get the EV chargers to, and that's partly led by demand from residents, but equally we want to create demand too for that. So there's a bit of a science to how we're going to do that, and there's obviously a bit of engagement with residents to understand where they want us to do it. And we're sort of using the model that we rolled out with cycle hangers parking, where people register their interest and we could sort of collate and understand on how many streets there is interest to deliver it. The key priority for me coming into the rollout is getting EV chargers onto our council estates. We know council estates disproportionately have slightly higher levels of car ownership. And also we want to make sure it's an equitable transition too. So we're committed to making sure that every single council estate has a electric vehicle charging point, if not more. And that's something that we're working towards as well. So the rollout has started to take place. We will see in the next year or two a massive rollout of probably 1,000 or more electric vehicle charging points. And as I say, in 2026, we would have completed 2,500 in addition to the 350 that we have at the moment. But I think what's worked very well, Andy, to answer your question, is that I think when we went out to the private sector and to market, I think going out with a larger offer in terms of providing that consistency to the private sector as well, not understanding that this isn't just as I say, 50 or 100 electric vehicle charging points. We're offering a longer term partnership. I think it attracted a lot of demand. We had a lot of interest through the turning around, and obviously very, very proud to be working with Zest, who the council is working with. But I think that would be my advice to other councils, is making sure that you're able to actually provide a long-term plan that is able to sort of provide both that consistency, but also helps reach your ambitions as well.
Great, thanks, Mete, for that update. I'm really interested in what's been happening in Hackney, and I know we'll get into the conversation around that very shortly. And I think there's something very interesting about following the demand and creating the demand, and that's definitely something that I think Colin has been talking about when he spoke, but also I think he's been having an ongoing conversation in the chat about it. And I'm going to come to you, Colin, first about that kind of apparent dichotomy between the two. I mean, what's the solution for that in your view? Should we just wait and see how things develop and then deal with the infrastructure following that? I mean, doesn't there need to be some push as well as pull, in your view?
There has to be, but there has to be some realism, as we found in Newcastle. So we put slow chargers across the entire city, including those areas who can't afford a second-hand current car. So there was no chance they were going to buy a brand new electric vehicle. So those chargers were never used. So what we're saying by the demand in geospatial planning is look at where people are likely to buy them. But the second thing is also consider what the private sector are doing, because massive high power hubs are being opened all across the country, which are replicating petrol stations. So do we go for we need to put 8,000 charge posts outside people's houses, or do we look at what people actually want to do? And this is the behaviour side. And this is, dare I say, a little bit also, and I have a huge sympathy for the councils. And I watched it on the politics show up here recently. Each council is measured in the press by the number of charge points they put in. So if I was a local councillor, I'd put as many lamppost chargers in as possible. Then I get pushed up the target list, and it all works very well. So I think there is a need, but I will also, last thing I would say is, when I talk to anybody who doesn't have an EV, they will tell me there's no charge points. When I point out the one that's 10 metres away, they say, I didn't know that was there. They don't, because they have no need for it. So they don't observe it. People only observe them and do the planning when they need one, such as I have, because at the moment I've moved into a property without a charge. I can't charge at home.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something that, you know, sort of resonates with me, because we live in a street house, a terraced house. I mean, we could do with a certain amount of, you know, jiggery pokery, and I know you can. There's these channel things now that go under the pavement and all the rest of it. But then you've still got the issue of someone then parking in the space. So I think there is still some stuff to be sorted out there. I just wanted to ask Juliet, given all this uncertainty, and you mentioned data yourself and the available data on all of this, how can we possibly facilitate or even identify the necessary flow of finance required to fund the appropriate charging infrastructure? You know, given all these uncertainties, how are you navigating that, minefield's the wrong word, but uncertain terrain, shall we say?
No, of course. And I think that, you know, what's maybe really important to mention is that this isn't the first sector or technology that has kind of had these these issues in terms of, you know, a rollout and uncertainty. My background used to be in fiber rollout, which is actually, you know, you can draw a lot of parallels. I know that there are limitations to that though. And equally, you know, other infrastructure projects also have had, you know, this uncertainty as well. So it's something the finance world have dealt with before. You know, data is, you know, really having, you know, lots of data available to them to feed into their models. Obviously, you know, I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and I've seen the most recent one that modeling, you know, it isn't always going to be right. You know, I spent years building models, which I definitely wouldn't stand 100% behind. But you take the data you have available, you put it in. The next best thing I would say is about collaboration and talking. So exactly as Colin said there, about councils and private sectors working together. Actually, you should also have finance and installers working together. You know, this is a joint up approach. You should all be sharing your learnings. You should help each other feed into models together. I think that is the best way to get models to be, you know, as accurate and helpful as they can be. I think, you know, coming back to something I mentioned in my presentation about how building ahead of demand obviously does help get drivers in. I think is that, you know, to echo Colin's point, and again in the chat, I think it's worded very well. You know, it is about just ahead of demand, and this is something that in the finance world with deploying infrastructure, you know, they have these models in place to decide, okay, well, we will beat demand by, you know, we'll build ahead by this much, but not just. So it's about getting a measured approach is really key. I think that's you know, I think that collaboration piece is just so vital.
Thanks, Julia. I just want to ask Mete, what's been your experience since embarking on this? How's it actually been received? You know, by your local population, really, and what lessons have you learned from that interface with the private sector and putting all this charging infrastructure in?
Yeah, what I mean. I mean, I was waiting for that to happen. Sorry. I think there's certainly a lot of what's happened is since we've made the announcement, which was last year, we had a lot of incoming queries around, you know, where would they be placed? As you can imagine, you know, lots of people are very interested to understand, you know, where the EV chargers will be placed. So that sort of brought forward a lot of inquiries, which in a way is you know, it's a good opportunity for us to be way ahead of time to think through our engagement plan with residents and how we sort of deploy them and how we work with our contractors and suppliers to make sure that we're able to sort of meet the needs. So there was a whole big sort of, you know, like, as you can always imagine when you announce a big policy like this, you know, a whole big conversation about what that looks like in practice. And we wanted to have that space between sort of awarding the contract via actually deploying the EV chargers. And partly that's because what we didn't want to be in a position is to sort of roll them out and then in hindsight sort of, you know, come across sort of some problems that residents have identified. So, and obviously that's inevitable, but, you know, we want to make sure that we're able to sort of take their views into account. So there's a lot of excitement for it. Look, I always say, and it's always slightly difficult to sort of say this in conversations like this. I think even though we are quite ambitious around our EV charging rollout, we in Hackney are very, very conscious that we don't want to see the number of petrol diesel vehicles replaced by EV cars. I think that would be a big problem for us in a London borough like us, where we disproportionately suffer from a lot of through traffic. We have 40% of traffic in Hackney either starts or ends in Hackney. So partly what we're trying to do as part of our sort of wider transport plans is to reduce car usage, and but where people have to drive, we're obviously trying to encourage them to use EV chargers when they become much more affordable. So there's a lot of conversation around, as I say, around the placement of the EV chargers, and there is a bit of excitement around it. I guess in terms of our experience of working with the private sector, as I said, so far it's been a great experience in the sense that, we've been able to look at this at a very macro level, thinking of it strategically about what this means, 5-6 years ahead. And that's part of the sort of the nature of the partnership that we have with Zest. I think it provides them the sort of the certainty to understand, how they build their business model around sort of Hackney over the next few years, and it's not a sort of short-term contract. And it also gives us the space to be able to sort of to experiment and to look at new ways of working with residents around that too. So, we're at the point now as we're talking where the delivery of the EV chargers are starting to be rolled out, or they're going to start to be rolled out. So, probably in a couple of months' time, I'll have a better idea of, what that looks like more in practice. But what we've been able to do is to use the learnings of the previous rollout of the EV chargers, albeit their small number, to sort of help feed into and help support Zest in making sure that they deliver for Hackney.
Thanks, Mete. Are you speaking to any of the local authorities? Have any of the local authorities reached out to you to get the benefit of what you're doing?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I sit on a pardon me, sorry, one second, I'm losing my voice. So I sit on the London Council's Transport and Environment Committee with my counterparts from other London boroughs. We regularly talk, particularly as cluster boroughs like in North East London or North London, with my counterparts to talk about not just around EV chargers, but we regularly exchange, thoughts and views on a whole wide range of different issues around, as I say, like buses, around EV chargers, around cycle hangers, what we're doing around sort of like vandalism, all that sorts of stuff. And this is an area that obviously we are sharing our sort of practice, and I know that through the London councils there are, through the committee, there are scheduled sessions where we do sort of look at best practice, and that is something that we've offered to other councils too.
Thanks. I just want to return to Colin again to this question of, what does the appropriate infrastructure look like? Do we have any idea what it is, and do we need to have, or are we just relying on, almost luck really? How do you view that whole situation?
Not being too flippant, but at the moment we're carpet bombing the UK with chargers. All right. If we want to take the scenario which I sometimes use, which was the coronavirus, across the country we were mapping where there was clusters of virus, and we were asking why there's clusters of virus, and we would apply things. I've recently been looking at the entire Scottish network, and what we're looking at is where are these chargers being used, and not just plugged in delivering power. All right, so at the time of day, where there's a cluster of chargers, they're being heavily used. So the question is why? All right, why are these in this part of the city being heavily used, and these in this part of the city not being used? Now, sometimes, and again, I sympathise with councillors, it's political. We'll make sure the whole city is covered with chargers, and if that's done for political reasons, I fully accept that. But unless we have a method of reinforcing where need exists, and then, so if we know that an area is heavily used, we rate that as red, right? If, like substations, we know in this area they're getting heavily used, they're now at a defined amber, we need to do something. That's where we should be focusing the attention, because the demand is growing in that region. But also, when I first got my EV, if I could do 86 miles, I was dead chuffed. I can now go from Newcastle to the Lake District and back without charging. So my behaviours are changing. We've only got one EV in the house, and we charge that twice a month, right? So that's twice a month now. If we go to 300-mile range, I might be charging it once a month. So all these behaviours are ignored, and we're not being smart. And the government grant system encourages councils to act in a way, because of the funding rules, to deliver charges. And I say, I've worked with about 20 local authorities on this, and I have utmost sympathy with what they're trying to do, both politically and what I call the numbers game as well. So I think we need a national demand-based model with proper modelling, and then target and support councils that need the help.
Thanks, Colin. I'm glad you mentioned local authorities, because it seems to me, and it's clear, I think from the Hackney example, that local authorities are going to have to play an absolutely key role in all of this. And I know that the Green Finance Institute recently published its local climate bonds toolkit to help unlock investment in this area. Julia, can you just tell us briefly, because we're running out of time, how that works and what your hopes are for that?
Yeah, of course. So a local climate bond represents an additional source of funding that local authorities can use. So obviously this is after any grants that they get from government. And what it is it's a type of community investment. So it actually enables local authorities to raise capital to fund decarbonisation projects, such as charging infrastructure, but also like solar panels and retrofitting in the area. It allows them to raise that capital direct from locals in the area. So it's a crowdfunding, crowdsourcing platform, and you can invest as little as £5 via this platform or more. And we've seen some local authorities being able to raise upwards of £1 million via this form of fundraising. And what's been really nice is, and I don't know the exact numbers unfortunately, but most of the local residents don't claim the interest on their investment. So it's just kind of even more capital, because for them they view it as an investment in their local area. So it's another form of capital for local authorities. So the toolkit is out beginning of this month, and it was to help local authorities on their journey of raising the climate bond. And if you just want to know a bit more about it, would definitely recommend you going to have a look at the toolkit and obviously come with any questions, and my colleagues will be happy to answer.
Great stuff. Thanks, Juliet, for that. We've run out of time, unfortunately. I think we could have run this session for a lot longer than what we have, and I'm sure it's something that we're going to return to in the future, because I know there's massive interest in this. Every other conversation that I seem to have, with colleagues and also friends, particularly when we talk about what car you're getting next, inevitably it is a conversation around not just EVs but also the charging network as well. So I think it is a topical issue, and one that we do need to return to. Coming up next, we have at 10 o'clock our second keynote session of the day on the issue of on-site power, and we'll also be touching on the whole kind of battery area as well, and fleet EVs and all the rest of it. So very much a theme going on this morning. I just want to thank our panel for their contributions, Councillor Mete, Coban, Juliet Flamank, and also Colin Herron. Really appreciate your time and input this morning. That's it from us for now. After a short break, we'll see you back at 10 a.m.